Carla Powers. I'm the manager of the public library, and on behalf of the library and our committee, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Jane Brissett, our One Book coordinator, is passing out evaluation forms, and if you could take just a minute at the end of the program to give us your thoughts, we would sure appreciate it. And before we get started tonight, I want to mention our next event. Looking forward, on April 9th, a week from Monday, we have Dr. Stephen Huddleston coming to speak. He's completing a fellowship at Johns Hopkins University in cardiothoracic surgery. And he'll be coming to speak a little bit about Johns Hopkins, which, if you've read the book, you know it plays very prominently in the book that we're discussing. I'd also like to mention that if you don't have one of our resource guides yet, I've got a few with me. There are also some available upstairs in the library. This will tell all of the upcoming events and give you some discussion questions and food for thought when it comes to the book. And I think with that, I'm going to turn it over to our facilitators, who will be introducing themselves. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Carla. My name is Beth Domholt, and I am the Vice President for Academic Affairs at the College of St. Scholastica. And this particular One Community, One Book program is a real partnership between the library and Scholastica, and we're really excited about that. So I thought I would give you just a little bit of background for how Scholastica is connected with this, and then let my other co-facilitators introduce themselves. St. Scholastica is turning 100 this year. So is our Centennial. We were founded in 1812 by the Sisters of the St. Scholastica Monastery, who several are here tonight for the discussion. And we have a first-year seminar for all of our incoming freshman students. And as part of that, they participate in a common read. Because one of the things we want our students to have is some common intellectual ground to cover with each other, rather than just whatever the pop culture of the day is. And so, so when we look for a book for that common read at Scholastica, we are interested in books that will cross interest areas for students, because we have students who are interested in healthcare professions, who are interested in education, who are interested in business, who are interested in the humanities and the sciences. So we look for books that have a lot of those kinds of things in them. And this book certainly has that. So it's got healthcare, it's got ethics, it's got poverty, it's got social justice, it's got gender, it's got all kinds of meaty issues that would appeal across a wide segment of our school. For our Centennial, we wanted to celebrate our birthday, and trust me, we've got various parties and celebratory things, but we also wanted something that would be an intellectual event, that would be about what we are as an institution, which is an organization that was founded for the love of learning and that promotes learning and education. So we wanted an intellectual event. So probably 18 months ago, or 2 years ago even, we floated an idea with the public library that if we came up with a book that would work for us in our curriculum and for our Centennial, and that we could get the speaker here, would they be willing to partner with us and make it the One City, One Book Read? And they said yes, and Rebecca Skloot is coming on April 18th. And she'll be interviewed by Carrie Miller from NPR at the DECC, and that's going to be a fabulous event. And it doesn't cost anything, but you have to get a ticket. So if you haven't done that and are interested in that, you need to look for us online, and we'll and talk to our box office and such and get your tickets for that. But so that's how this all came about. What do I bring to this discussion other than my role as a spokesperson for Scholastica? Well, I'm a physical therapist, So that was my original work and my original profession. Much of my clinical career was at a county hospital in Indianapolis, Indiana. So with patients in very similar situations, patients and clients in similar situations in terms of poverty, in terms of their racial and ethnic background as the family here. So this really felt very familiar to me in terms of some of my experiences as a healthcare professional. When I started my career as a faculty member, I became very involved in research and scholarship within the rehabilitation disciplines, and so I had to learn the ins and outs of informed consent and all of those sorts of things. So many of the research issues for this also really resonated for me. So that's some of what I bring to the discussion is background as a healthcare provider and as a researcher who's needed to work within the current ethical framework for doing research with human participants. Heidi Johnson is also a member of the panel. I'll let her introduce herself.
I see everybody taking out their cell phones and turning them off. I'm a librarian, so therefore I don't have a cell phone. I am very anti-technology, and that's the role that I play in lots of areas of my life. Much to my children's chagrin, we'll see how far we can take it. But I'm Heidi Johnson, and I am the first year information literacy librarian at the college, so I work a lot with first-year students. Information literacy becomes a part of how to be a successful student so that they can stay at the college, how can they become a successful whatever student in their major, and then finally how can they be a successful, and again at the college we really look at lifelong learning, we look at a vocation, not just work, and how can that be something that they truly love. So that's what I do at the college. I'm also involved with some of the archives work for the college, so that's how I've gotten looped in with a lot of the Centennial events. But really, I come just as a librarian and as somebody who really loves to read, and that's me.
My name is Chris Gotti. I teach English at St. Scholastica, mostly first-year composition. That's been the bread and butter of my teaching since I started as a teacher in the mid-1990s. I also teach in the first-year seminar program Beth mentioned, which is called Dignitas. And the way I describe this program to people is that it is intended to engage faculty members from across the academic spectrum and students in conversations about human dignity, what it means to respect others, have self-respect, and respect basic human worth in all people. I have a very part-time job outside of St. Scholastica as a men's group facilitator with the Domestic Abuse Intervention Project, which is a violence prevention program started in Duluth by Ellen Pence and some other very courageous people in the early 1980s, and I've been doing that work for a couple of years, and my teaching informs it, and it informs my teaching, and that combined perspective informed my perspective on this book, and I was just really excited to have a conversation that combined our three perspectives. We met for a few minutes yesterday afternoon, and I was really excited after that conversation. I think we diplomatically challenged each other's perspectives in some interesting ways. We muddied the waters quite a bit, and we only stopped talking because Beth had a meeting, but I think we started some neat conversations that, if are any indication, something like that is going to happen tonight.
Hopefully we didn't steal each other's thunder.
I thought it was very interesting that we met to discuss how this session was going to work. And we never got around to that because we just started talking about the book. So we want this to be like your book group, only bigger and without the wine. and so we didn't come prepared with comments or slides. We obviously came with lots of ideas, and we're like all good college teachers, we can hold forth for long periods of time if necessary, but we also know how to be quiet and require one of our students to start the discussion. So we would open it up for discussion.
Have you heard the Radio Lab program when they had you at the Skloot?
No, I have not.
That would be something, if you would love to hear, like to hear that. It's an archive, radio lab, very, very interesting. And they interview some of the other people, the nurse, some of the other people that are involved with that book too. So it's very interesting. That's how I found out about the book.
Was there anything in that program that raised a question for you or that was particularly interesting that you'd like to throw out to get some discussion going?
I think when they talked to the nurse who actually took the cells first to try to get them to grow because they had been trying so many different cells, and they actually started growing, and they just kept growing and growing and growing, and it was just this amazing thing of that moment of thinking something's different, nothing's going to be the same anymore, and then just how that just kept mushrooming into all these different areas, and how the book just goes in so many different paths. But it was very interesting to hear the actual people, the doctors that they actually talked to, and I think that Ms. Skloot is probably one of the best authors I've ever read, and how she can take all that technology and make it so amazing. So it's very good. It's a very good clip.
I was somewhat confused, perhaps I read it too fast, that they started with the initial cancer cells and yet they were able to do all these experiments with them. One would think they would need normal cells to do all these HIV and other experiments they did. Can anybody explain that? Why the cancer cells worked?
I can take a stab at it. I know we probably have some folks in the room who might also have some science background or some medical background who could do it. That what is primarily different about cancer cells from normal cells is that they don't know how to shut off. They don't know how to keep from reproducing. So they still have many, if not all of the same kinds of cellular processes that go, so they have to take in food and fuel, and they have to process it, and they have to do all of the functions that normal cells do. It's just that they don't have the thing that tells it to quit reproducing, to quit dividing. So the cancer, and that's what makes cancer cells problematic in our bodies, is that they work too well, if you will. They just keep multiplying and multiplying and multiplying and don't shut off. And so from that standpoint, we think of them as cells that we don't want to be a part of us because they're abnormal, but from a scientific model, they're a cell that works exceedingly well at doing what cells are supposed to do, and when they're isolated in the lab, they're not problematic. It's a good thing that they keep reproducing rather than being problematic to the organism that they're a part of.
So the cell, nothing within the cell itself is malignant. It's just that they have the trigger is gone or there or something,
I believe that's a reason for
whatever.
that malignant cells are cells that reproduce uncontrollably and that travel to different parts of the body when they're in the organism, but when they're outside the organism, they're just a cell that reproduces very well.
Well, I don't think that a malignant cell necessarily knows that it's bad. It just knows that it's a living being, where, like, as a virus actually pirates cells to, like, grow. A malignant cell just keeps growing. I had the same issue. I had the same problem, but I still have a thought that, like, how can they develop all these things to save our lives from a cell that ultimately can kill us? I mean, but what I thought is really the cell it's a living organism, just like a healthy cell is a living organism. But microbiology-wise, it's very far for me to figure out how they can develop a vaccine to save people's lives from a bad cell, but yeah. Mm-hmm.
But there's also the irony that struck me was that the family was not even able to get.
I'm sorry, would you speak louder, please?
The other irony that I found interesting was that the family could not even get health coverage when, you know, these cells from the mother went on to do so much. So it's a book of real, you know, teeter-totters and ironies and one extreme to the other. So that was my struggle, not the biology so much as the, you know, the ethics part of that.
Plus the fact that the husband said no, they couldn't take the cells, and they took them anyway. I just thought that was very unethical also.
And one of the things that the three of us started talking about was how to tease apart all the different parts of this story and say where's the harm or where's the wrong. So you just teased out a little piece and said, they asked me, said no, that was wrong. And then you talked about another piece, so the cells have contributed to advancing healthcare, but they can't afford healthcare. And in teasing that apart for myself, it's certainly ironic, but I don't know that that's the wrong in this chain of things, because in the US there are lots of people who can't afford healthcare. And so to me, I see the fact that the family can't afford healthcare is ironic, but that it maybe has very little to do with the HeLa cell story. It has to do with how we in the United States decide to or not to fund healthcare. So that to me is a different kind of a wrong in this story.
But I also think had they explained to him what they wanted to do and why they wanted to do it, perhaps he would have agreed, but it was just like they left him kind of in the dark, and so he wasn't able to make a real decision on only one based on emotions.
But at that point, did they know what was going to happen? I mean, they, you know, I can't remember exactly the chronology, but I don't think at that point they knew the implications of what they were taking to
But if they would have
explain.
even explained to him why they wanted to take them, I mean, I don't think they,
And
that
that
didn't
brings,
sound like they even said we want to do research or whatever. I think.
right, and that brings up the greater good concept, you know.
What rights do any of us have as we go into testing or whatever in a clinic or hospital? What happens to cells of ours?
I think now than it was back in 50s. Now you have a lot of rights, and nothing will be done unless you give your informed consent. So much has changed. And back in the 50s, that's just how they did business. They didn't, asking informed consent wasn't a huge priority, and it didn't seem like it was necessary. But through the years, and with looking back at a lot of research that was done in horrible conditions and horrible ways, the laws have changed through the years so that now it's a rather stringent approach to any kind of research, where there's documents that the participant in the research has to learn about, understand, and then consent to if they want to, and not if they don't.
And interesting, along with how laws have changed and how consent policies have changed, it's interesting for me, bless you, to think about how beliefs may have changed and how thinking has changed. And as I was walking home after our conversation yesterday, I was thinking about what must the doctors who harvested the tissue from Henrietta Lacks' cervix and who initiated that process of attempting to grow those cells, what was the thinking that allowed them to do that without gaining consent? And then what influenced thinking to change in between then and now? I'd like to throw that to the group. What thinking was behind not believing consent was needed, and how did that thinking change to now where it's almost unfathomable to many of us that anyone could have believed that or could have thought that.
Before we get into that, it was my understanding of the author's final notes in the book that although informed consent for a procedure on the person is pretty much universal now, there's still a patchwork of laws depending on the state as to whether a person is entitled to be informed if tissue that's been removed is going to be used for a particular purpose. As she pointed out, in many places, if you go in and have a mole biopsy, that tissue is preserved at the clinic or at the hospital, and what is your interest in it after that? If someone were to take it and use it for some kind of experimentation, there is no effect on you. So the question is informed consent really necessary there? That was the issue that struck me, is this issue of, okay, yes, of course I have to be told if they're going to inject me with syphilis or something as a Tuskegee, obviously. But if I go in and have a wart removed, and they keep that and use it for some test, what is my interest in that? It was something I wanted to be rid of.
I think it's that you went in and said you wanted it. She didn't say she wanted it. Nobody in the family said that they wanted them to take these cells and to reuse them. And there was just a gap there. I think it was that whole thing of living in an area where everything that was done to you was done by somebody big up higher. And they were terrified of Johns Hopkins. And I think one of the most poignant things in the book is the way the daughter that was institutionalized was treated. And the horrible experiments they did on her. And how it just happened that after all those records were erased, her picture was still there so that we see her face. That was just uncanny to me to see that this is a family who has had somebody else do things to their people that they had no say-so over and had no knowledge of knowing, and the horrors that they went through. It was just one more example of that. There's no rights, no, you know.
So what's your name? Sorry.
Ruth.
So Ruth is talking about some of the power issues that come out in that book. So let's hold that here for just a minute, because I wanna respond to one of your questions. And I'm not an attorney. I don't play one on TV. So I don't know about the various state laws regulating tissue, but I do know that in the current environment, most of the blanket consent forms that one signs now basically say, and we can do whatever we want to do. So want to with your tissues after it's left your body. So that healthcare facilities have built the tissue issue into their consent forms, and then where the gray area is, I think for the most part, is sort of all the stuff that might be accumulated in places in that time frame when people weren't, formally consenting to those kinds of uses.
Because what Dr. Sandy explained to us on Monday that kind of came up was he said that in one way, keeping those biopsies, which they keep, is for your health, for your own use later on, so that they have that. They have to keep it for 10 years, I think he said, is the procedure that they do. And so it isn't an issue of doing experiments with it only. It's an issue of keeping that record for use as your healthcare progresses. if you've had a biopsy that they've made a diagnosis from. They need to keep that in order to, you know, to go forward. So that makes sense to me.
I'd like to come back to what I think was your question, which I find is an interesting one, Chris. I think it's not too many years ago that we simply accepted that we had no role in our own health care. The doctor knew what he was doing, and we just trusted the doctor. And I think some of the things that the book seems to point out that helped change that attitude were experiments that were done by the Nazis that had came to the consciousness of, or that Tuskegee experiment that was done on prisoners, I think, or
No,
That was in the Air Force.
Sure, okay, but those kinds of experiments that people paid no attention to, and as the media grows and we all become more aware of that, then our complete attitude towards our health care and our relationship with healthcare providers has changed a great deal.
That's, pardon me for just a moment. So Beth asked that we hold this, the issue of power that Ruth raised and come back to it. And I think that's both our, those of us who aren't healthcare professionals, we've come to see our relationship to the people who provide our healthcare differently. It also seems like our engaged consciousness has helped providers see their role differently as well, and maybe they treat their own power differently than we treat it. So I'd like to put that next to what Beth was holding out in the air too.
Well, I was just going to comment on the attitude at the time. My father was a general surgeon, and I had my gallbladder out a number of years ago, but in any event, he came to visit, and he in the hospital room, it was just sort of a side conversation he was having with the doctor that took my gallbladder out. But he commented to the doctor, he said, you know, he was practicing in the 50s, and he said he just routinely at that time, he'd just take a little slice of the liver and send it off to the lab. I doubt that the patient ever knew it happened, and he said, you know, he wasn't doing that anymore. But that was the attitude at the time, and it was intended, of course, to be beneficial to the patient. But that's just what was happening in those days, and we have changed considerably since then.
I think another thing that's really changed, that's helped to change that, is the consciousness of exactly what DNA can tell people about you. And that didn't exist then. So there wasn't this idea that if they have your cells, they can know everything somehow. You know, and that whole idea that there's this coded information out there that belongs to you didn't exist at all.
But informed consent occurred before DNA. So, I mean, that was pretty much in place.
But what would have happened had the family been given the opportunity to deny the hospital's access to these cells? None of these discoveries would have happened. So, you know, to say that, you know, in all regards, you know, to deny access to something like that is a good thing isn't necessarily maybe the right thing either.
Well, I don't know that the family would have necessarily said no if it had been explained adequately what the use was going to be.
Well, I don't think they knew at that point what the use was going to develop into. So, you know,
Well-
they were just going to say, can we take some of your cells, I think is what they're...
But part of their attitude too in that is that, and this is on page 30 of the book, and I mentioned this yesterday, when I read through the book a second time, this is the part that came out the most to me, but it comes back to power a little bit too, and that the doctors didn't necessarily feel that they needed to explain this to somebody who was poor, who was of a lower class, who was a woman, who was black. So some of these things come out too in their attitude towards that patient, and that, you know, perhaps things were different, perhaps not. But on page 30 it says that, you know, these scientists believe that since patients were treated for free in the public wards, it was fair to use them as research subjects as a form of payment. And we come back to what is fair and what is just. And I guess I just want to throw that out there, but I think that's part of the attitudes at the time, is just, if you were, really a white male doctor, what role did you feel that you had to play towards this black poor woman? And again, how has that changed a little bit? How have all of us been empowered with our own health care? And what did it take to get there? And unfortunately, I think those steps always will take, unfortunately, people like Henrietta Lacks and her family, for us to be aware of what the situation is, and so that we can all play a part in changing that.
Well, hearing this discussion makes me think that this last week I went in for just a checkup, a 6-month checkup. And the girl, when I was registering, just handed me this paper and said, this is the consent form. And it was lined where I could sign my name. I didn't even think of reading it. I just signed my name. I didn't know what they were saying in it. So from now on, I'm going to kind of be a little more aware of what's in that consent form.
But if you say no, are you going to have your checkup?
Yeah, true.
If you don't.
True.
I'd be interested in knowing if anybody else thinks that a distinction ought to be made between the physicians that were dealing directly with Henrietta and the researchers who received the cells, not even knowing from whom they were taken or under what circumstances, and just I went ahead. When we talk about the power issue, yes, there is that relationship between Henrietta and the doctor, but so much of this story, or so much of the success of the use of those cells in medical advancements were by people who didn't know that Henrietta Lacks even existed.
They did have a belief about not needing to know who Henrietta Lacks was, whether her name was Henrietta Lacks or
Helen Larson.
or anything else. I don't have a follow-up to that. This is my.
But I do think I agree with that point to an extent, because I really tried to see the second time I read this, again, where the whole chain becomes bad, and I mentioned this yesterday too. The whole chain is something that's very painful for this family, and I totally agree with that. But when you start taking apart the links, and that's what I was trying to do, to see where did that become something that was an ethical issue. We have Henrietta being able to get, I think, some pretty decent care at Johns Hopkins. I mean, she had standard treatment at the time. Just because she was a poor black woman didn't mean that she had any less of a chance of getting better care. And so she herself, I think, got the treatment that she deserved. And perhaps even now, I mean, I think that we don't necessarily, do we have it? Locally at Johns Hopkins that would treat someone like that completely free and not have it be any burden to the family? I don't know. So to a certain extent even, was it perhaps even slightly better care to a certain extent than what we might have equitably now? So because of the whole situation with Henrietta as how it starts, I think it was good. And what she got as far as her care was good. Unfortunately, it had a terrible outcome for her as a patient, but as a human being, it was as good as it could be given the situation. But then we start this chain. Okay, so now we have these cells, and they didn't know what they were going to do, and they didn't take the time to explain it, and now they're doing all of these amazing things. We have this scientist that's really excited that finally he's got some immortal cells, and he's going to send these to the world because he's hoping this is going to solve the world's problems. Is that bad? Did he do that with malicious intent? Was that wrong? And then we have, Tuskegee, and we have actually these cells were first given to, black researchers to try to work on this polio vaccine originally, and that's good, and so we have some good for a while.
For a long while, I think, because Dr. Sandy was saying that he was pretty certain that there never would have been a Salk vaccine if this hadn't happened. There never would have been the research that happened with HIV had this not happened. So there is a huge amount of research that would not have happened without this. And I guess one of my struggles is, if she could have known all of that, would she have said no? I mean, why would you want to hold on to cancer cells if they could help somebody else? And, recently there was a blood drive where I was asked if I would be part of the study. And I had to sign a thing that was just exactly like the informed consent. Yeah, I'm going to let go of this, and no, I don't have any financial, anything coming to me for having, so they're very explicit about all of that now because there's a lot more knowledge. But one of the things that really struck me in our discussion on Monday was that he said that as an oncologist, clinical trials, and this is different because something's coming into you, so it's a little bit different in terms of that. But he said 90%, almost 90% of children that have cancer, their parents agreed to clinical trials. And to some extent, because of that, 85% of children's cancers can be cured. And with adults, only 10% of adults will agree to be on clinical trials. And he said, I know that there are different biologies, but how unaware of the public good are we in terms of and in giving up something that we're not going to use seems even more of an argument to me that why wouldn't you not do that? And if we are not concerned with the public good to the extent that we're not even going to give up cancer cells or blood or whatever else could be beneficial, what does that say about society too?
I'm curious about who gets to decide what we do with our own bodies. Because everything you say is very compelling to me. I agree with all of it, and we look back on these cells that were harvested in 1951, and no one here is being dismissive at all, but we are saying, my goodness, it's this little question: can we take this culture? We're going to do some research on it, and had she said no, what would or wouldn't have happened? But at that point of contact, at that point of encounter between a vulnerable human being and a human being in great power, the human being with power decided he got to choose for this other person. And I think of other situations in which that's happened in ways that maybe to the person in power seemed inconsequential, or it seemed benign or even benevolent. They still were making a decision about what another human being should do, how another human being should believe. I get stuck on that. That's what I'm looking forward. I appreciate your comments. I'm looking forward to hearing what other people have to say as well.
I also just think that they were the physicians and the ones wanting to grow the cells were also very naive. I mean, they hadn't been successful, and then all of a sudden, like wham, this one's working, and pretty soon they had more cells in their lab than they knew what to do with. They were, needing more room. So I think it kind of, like what, Beth Heidi said, is it just started out, like, I think all scientific things just start with an idea and let's just try all this stuff. Even like Apple computers from a garage in a Palo Alto. And now there's this scandalous stuff about the factories in China that make, employing children, just totally violating human rights over there. And it's the same for, that's more just scientific. This is biological, but kind of the same way as it just kind of gets out of hand. But look at what we benefit from.
Yes, it's probably true that everybody in this room has benefited from her HeLa cells. If nothing,
Definitely.
the Salk vaccine.
Those accounts of the conditions at Apple factories have been largely discounted.
Oh, wait, I know that, because I actually watched the news today too, but I don't know, there's a lot of other things like same thing.
Your question, this was a malignancy. The woman did not want it in her body. So someone made the decision to take part of it. It was unwanted. So how is that different than the individual that removes the garbage from your house?
Dumpster divers that go through your garbage and then...
I mean, we're talking about a human being in garbage.
No, we're talking about a malignancy in garbage.
But you're consenting, when you put your garbage out, you're consenting.
Right.
to that.
I guess I'm gonna ponder that for a moment. You started to raise your hand before.
Well, all of the conversations, sort of like, well, look how far it's gotten us. All I can keep thinking is, but do the ends justify the means? I don't think so. I mean, to me, and I don't know if this is what you're thinking, the power differential, and of course the time was different and society was different, but the power differential does make a difference to me. And the not asking her, or at least telling her what they were going to be doing, even if they didn't know what it was going to lead to, that makes a big difference to me. And if we have these wonderful results now, that still doesn't make it right what was done then, I guess is all.
But I don't think that what was done to her wouldn't have been done to anybody else. It wouldn't have mattered if it was a, white male who was 60 years old. They had cancer cells from all kinds of people that they were treating from cancer. So they would have taken, that was standard procedure that they would have done with everybody. That wasn't just her.
So they were taking any cell,
Right.
seeing if it had
And
grown.
it just hadn't worked until that time. It just happened to be that the cells from that particular person worked. It could just as easily have been an old person who was dying, who was wealthy. It wasn't an issue because they just took the cells and they tried them with everybody. Yeah.
They I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, I'm sorry, what's your name? Heidi?
Heidi, yeah.
I'm gonna blame this on, okay? We got stuck, you were talking about the links in the chain. We got stuck on this link, okay? And we're talking about how, oh well, they took the cells, what does it matter? Close the book, we're out of here. There's something in that book that reached each and every one of us, or we wouldn't be here tonight. There's something that was fundamentally wrong with doing that. Granted, they took the thing out and whatever, but it went on to so much more. Was she still alive when the cells were taken, when they first found out? So, okay, they didn't talk to her then. As far as I know, she was coherent right most of the time till the very end. And what if somebody would have gone to her and said, you know what, Henrietta, I know you're going through all this, but look, you know what, you have contributed to great research in this country, and said that to her, and her family that was never talked to about.
One person does say that they did go and approach her bedside and said, your cells are going to change the world. I mean, that was...
That's right.
Was it said to her in a way that she really understood it? I mean, I guess we don't know.
And I didn't...
But I mean, it wasn't like that was the end of it either. I mean, there was
didn't completely
family
change though.
involved.
I mean, that's what we were trying to tease out. Is, you had... I think it's important to start really seeing where was the harm and to separate perhaps that the harm that was done to the family, there for sure was harm done to the family. I didn't complete the whole chain because I didn't want to monopolize the next 45 minutes, but, I mean, but I think it's important to really, to take each of these actions and to really, because yes, there were horrible things because Henrietta died. Think about what happened to her daughter and the abuse, and think about Sonny and Zechariah, the abuse that they had because they had no mother. But was that because of these cells being taken from her? I think it's important that we also don't just blame doctors in the 50s for treating Henrietta Long. We also blame, where were the people in the community that were seeing what was happening to these children? That this kid was being locked up in a basement, tied up, sent to a hospital because he was beaten. What about the dad watching his daughter get punched in the face after having unwanted? I mean, there's more, and I think when we read the book, we have to realize that there's lots of social issues in here. And if we condense it all down to HeLa cells and were those taken wrongly, I think we're missing the power that the story can have, which is we can't change whether or not HeLa cells were taken. But what we can change are kids that live on the hillside in Duluth that also have parents who aren't taking care of them. These are things that we actually could do today that are issues in our midst that this story also raises, that we're part of this chain. The thing at the end of the story is you're so upset about what happened to this family. And I think it's important to recognize what are direct actions from HeLa, but what are also actions that happen because of other causes. And perhaps some of those causes can be things that still exist today that we also perhaps could help fix. That's what I'm talking about. So you end the book with this huge, ugly chain. But I think it's important to really try to analyze that and see what.
Yeah. I was curious too, you mentioned her treatment. Was it normal in those days to give people radiation so much that their skin turns black? I mean, I just thought that was,
Yeah.
that's awful.
I have to recapture my train of thought now. Well, one thing I think that really was very remarkable and selfless was that these cells went to the lab where Dr. Guy was realizing that something so important was happening that anybody else who wanted to try to further the cause, he was just perfectly willing to give them those cells. And that's the way they spread, I think, to so much research. And I think that was a very good thing. He was really, I don't know if he was naive or selfless or whatever he was, but it was a good action. But one thing that has bothered me in the book is that when they went back later to take blood tests from the family, and they didn't know why they were being taken, and they were all terrified that it was because they had cancer too, and nobody was telling them. And that really
that's wrong.
Yes, and I believe that in this long link, you know, so Guy being very generous with the cells was a good thing. And the example you just had of later getting blood from the family without appropriate explanation and consent, you know, does appear to be one of the links in the chain that is tainted, that is wrong.
But even that was a tragic coincidence. The person who should have explained it to them had a very limited command of English. It was that doctor from China. Now, granted, her boss, who is implied to be very successful and also arrogant, blankety blank, said, you know, go get blood samples from them. He didn't explain to her either, but even if he had, could she have been able to explain to them? There's no value judgment in that. She didn't speak English that well. You know,
But somebody must have been able to tell them they needed the blood, so they could have also explained to them why. I mean, even though she couldn't speak English, somebody had to have spoken English to tell her.
Well, she could speak some English, she said, according to the book, but she wasn't particularly fluent in it, was the implication I got.
Well, this
A couple of
certainly
thoughts
really,
that occur to me. One is that, you know, as some of us have said, it was the practice at the time. There was to be taking cells without telling the patient. And I have a little trouble in judging by our standards today what was happening then. But the other thing that really bothers me about all of what happened with all of this is that it's a very poor family. It's still a very poor family. And there are some out there who have made huge amounts of money off of these cells with no effort at all to contact the family and to try and help them to at least some degree. And that just doesn't sit right.
I think the other thing that the family was looking for was just recognition. Just that there was a large part of the book just tracking down her real name. They wanted her real name out there so that people knew it wasn't just a Gila cell, it was their mother, you know, that was making this contribution. And if they could have gotten that recognition, you know, irregardless of the financial, you know, I think they would have felt better about maybe what they had gone through.
I don't know if it's just me, but I think we're all overlooking the fact this was back in 1951. And it was in Mississippi. And what was going on in the South in 1951? I mean, hey, the black people weren't treated equally. There was all the marches and everything. I don't think that they cared.
You mean the
hospital,
researchers and the
yes,
doctors?
Yes, I don't think they cared. It was a poor black woman who had cancer, cervical cancer. I don't think they cared. It was 51. All these books that we read about racism and everything, all the terrible things that happened back then, and things that are still happening, I think it all goes to that.
You don't think the doctors cared about Henrietta when they were treating her? The
Not that
doctors
they didn't care, but if there was a way to, this wasn't hurting her taking the cells, but if there was a way to further their,
Because there's the doctors and the scientists. And the scientists know that she was a black woman. I mean,
but none of us have lived in the South in that time frame. And if we all think back to the books that we've read and documentaries we've seen and how bad the black people were treated, I think this all falls into it.
I don't know, because they were at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, and that hospital was founded for.
Yes, I realize that.
For people
Yeah.
that were poor, so I don't know. I
Your
understand
point.
what you're saying, the power thing, but.
I think your point about it could have been a 60-year-old white male. I think that is.
It could have, that, if his cells had worked, the same thing would have happened. It wouldn't have mattered.
And that's why I wonder about the whole idea of whether the family deserved some portion of the money that was being made through those cells. It could have been anybody. These advancements were not made because of anyone's ingenuity or industry. It just happened to be her. I can understand why the family would want recognition for it and would feel that they deserve some compensation, but looking at it from the outside, objectively, if you will, I don't.
So I
don't see that.
What was when George Guy, so Talin is the oncologist or the physician who treats Henrietta. He takes the biopsy, or he takes the tissue, and it goes to Guy's lab, and his sort of bedraggled research assistants say, oh my goodness, another sample. Oh my goodness. Guy, he and other researchers may have been naive to, they didn't have a crystal ball. They couldn't see 15 minutes or 2 years down the road, but they knew what they wanted to happen. They were trying to create or identify immortal cells. So he gives that tissue that he got from the physician to his research, and all of a sudden it starts to grow. And his thought pattern is, my goodness, this is great. We have to, there's a whole description of what the hubbub is like in the lab, and then he generously provides. He starts sending them all over the country. He sends some to the University of Minnesota, and they get sent all over. And it's a fair amount of time before people start making real money off of them. I'm curious about what in that whole process prevents anyone, what the thinking is that prevents them from thinking, we ought to let her family know. This is really neat stuff. Let's tell our other research partners, let's tell other scientists, let's get something published. And I'm a little bit, I understand times were different, but I'm not sure that, I still have the question about what was so different about what they thought that prevented them from saying, we should contact this woman's husband, we should contact this woman's family, they may want to know that their dearly departed mother is, it looks like, going to be a part of history because something's happened. So that it all comes down to me as generous in one way, but just not thinking about human beings in another way. That's my perspective.
I think that's a key to something. I think that's a key. These men are scientists. One, they don't look back to where this came from because they look forward. As scientists and researchers look forward. It just wasn't part of their mindset. The other was, you say, didn't think about the human beings. No, it's long been my belief that geniuses have to be jerks. They have to be fixated. They have to be tightly focused. And whether these were bona fide geniuses or not, I mean, this was somebody with a mission, something that he was totally focused on, which was developing these immortal cells. And yeah, human beings just were part of his mindset.
I agree,
So-
she was just, I mean,
Oh, well,
just cells.
you just pointed out the division between the doctors and the scientists. So that's why the scientists had no relationship, of course, to the patient, because the doctor dealt with the patient. And there was a chasm, a division.
And they don't have a whole lot of relationship to the doctors even. In some ways, you know, all these things that are going on in labs are not being back to, you know, it's not like they have primary care physicians. You know, the GP isn't gonna hear
Right.
about what was going on with the experiments either, I don't think.
But somewhere, sometime, could someone have looked and said, what is the right thing to do? And I don't think anybody in the coaching really ever did this regarding Henrietta Lax's family.
I think the person who did that really is Rebecca
Yeah.
Skloot.
Mm-hmm.
And her
Yes.
contacting
Yes.
the daughter
Yeah.
of Deborah, because
Right.
Deborah really wasn't concerned about making any money. She just really wanted people to know that these were her mother's
more ethical, you know, search our morals for the right thing to do.
And I'd like to follow up on that issue that a couple of people raised about the family's or Deborah's desire for her mother to get recognition. And to me, that's another irony in this whole story, because the fact that their naming convention for cells was to take the first two letters of the first name and the first two letters of the last name, so that they could even, you know, follow it back and figure out who it was. That is not practiced. That would be seen as a violation of someone's privacy. And so on the one hand, the family is saying, well, you know, she deserves this recognition. But in today's context, if, you know, the many cells and in fact, you know, whole body parts that I've left in various healthcare facilities have, you know, that I signed some consent form for them to do with those tissues whatever they wished. It's my expectation that I would never be linked back to those tissues. So that if my hip joint, if the ball of my hip joint that somebody has somewhere that was removed when I had a hip replacement, if that is you know, leading to the cure for something or other, I would expect that there'd be no way to figure out that it was mine and not somebody else's. So that's almost an interesting twist on privacy and consent today and how we think about privacy. As long as I'm talking, I want to get one other point in that two others. One, I picture this lab looking like the cat in the hat, you know, with all these things just growing and all that, you know, that pink stuff that's all coming out and getting all over the house. So I have that image of this Dr. Seuss-like thing in the lab. But I'm struck a couple times in this book about the role that serendipity plays in science. So you're getting cells after cells after cells, and finally one. You don't know why, but this one keeps reproducing. And then later in the book, they talked about somebody accidentally spilled something on some of the HeLa cells that separated all the chromosomes, and that became the accident that helped them start really mapping the human genome. And so I'm struck by that. I don't know how that comes back to you know, the wrongs or the ethical issues, but that's a big part of science is slogging away until something clicks, and you don't always know why or what it's going to be.
It's really amazing to me how sometimes something that can be intended for harmful purposes can end up being so beneficial. Like I think all the time about lasers. Now here's something that was developed to be a weapon, and you know, this idea in the 60s that everybody's going to have laser guns, and now what lasers do for eyes and for other kinds of surgery, it's really amazing. And you know, of course, sometimes it goes entirely in reverse. It's something that's meant to be really beneficial ends up being a Pandora's box.
I have a vague memory of listening to a radio program about a man that seemed like it was Sunday morning. Within the last 6 months, he was trying to get his readings that he was sending over the telephone, so I'm assuming diabetes, heart arrhythmia. He was trying to get his own readings, and he was not allowed to get his own readings. So when you talk about a mole that was on me, that was part of me, and is in a jar somewhere, these aren't anything. They're numbers. They're little bits of information. And it was at least a 10-minute information. It wasn't, anyway, nobody else? Is that ringing a bell to anybody? Early Sunday morning? I have to wait.
Well, that may have been a verification issue, though. There was no way that he could establish he was who he said he was and entitled to the
It was more
information.
than that.
Yeah.
He had, I'll have to try to go back and listen to all my car archives. Yeah.
I wonder if I could bring up another sort of ethical issue that doesn't have to do, has to do with writing. And I think, you know, that this was discussed a little bit on Monday about what is creative technical writing. What is how much of this has really happened, and how much did she sort of fill in? And is it okay to fill in? I mean, I think sort of the perception is it's okay to do that because it's bringing up all these important issues. What is it? You know, I mean, where do you draw the line with extrapolating out and crafting something creatively that may not be entirely accurate or may be nuanced by your bias?
Are there particular parts of the book or types of parts of the book that you're
Well, like
talking
that
about?
last scene, you know, about did that really happen where, you know, the one person that claims to have had this conversation where she said, you know, where he said that how much she's helping the people. You know,
Okay.
that, you know, they're just different things that end up getting kind of dramatized.
My sense is that she was an extremely careful and painstaking researcher, and that she doesn't say that happened, she says one person said it happened. So she's not claiming that that actually happened.
She carefully attributes it to one particular
Yeah,
person.
yeah.
She also, in the foreword, goes into detail as to how she verified the accuracy of what she was describing. I'd note too that evidently her training is as a science writer, which is, as a writer myself, I know some of the nuances, and they're not the sort to stray far from what they can objectively verify. It doesn't work. I think as a science writer, she was marvelous at describing the human aspects of this. And particularly for one so young, I was very impressed by that. But no, this is also becoming a new trend in nonfiction, a book called Game Change of a couple of years ago about the last presidential campaign, took the same approach. Conversations that the writers hadn't actually witnessed were recounted verbatim, and what they had done was then go to people who had, and not just one, but several people who had witnessed the conversation firsthand, and said, "Did we get this right? Was this what this person said? Was this what that person said?" And she apparently has done some of that in this book too.
Yeah, I do think though that that's a trend in writing and in movies that's growing. Like look at the movie The Queen. You know, you have whole scenes that that are fabricated, and it really blurs the line between what actually happened and what is in the imagination.
Mm-hmm.
And you may be getting maybe it's accurate, maybe it's not, but you'll never know. And not all of it gets verified. I'm not talking about Rebecca Skloot specifically, but
one thing I wanted to say about fiction writers who use historical settings, that if they're good writers, they're very good historical researchers, because they understand that people are often getting history from whatever the fiction is that they're reading. And they would lose all credibility. Of course, there's room for the imagination, and an actual scene might not have happened, but it would be as close to the historical interpretation of whatever that scene was as they could possibly make it.
But that's if every writer is ethical, and I'm not sure that's always the case.
I'm talking now about historical fiction writers.
And
I'm sure there are romance writers that are not.
No, but I don't think every historical fiction writer is necessarily ethical, and I don't think, like having a scene, between Philip and Elizabeth is, in any way.
This book is not historical fiction. It's not fiction.
No, I was just.
I wish my one of my office mates is Dr. Bill Miller, who teaches history both at St. Scholastica and at UMD, and is an Egyptologist and a Lincoln Scholar and presidential scholar. And I think he might chime in and say not all historians are ethical writers.
Yeah.
And that he seems certainly to believe that I don't know that he would necessarily say history is a lie agreed upon, but history is a story agreed upon. And the most careful researcher is still filtering research, still accessing research that was produced through the filters of many people's decisions and biases and beliefs. And then they're making their own decisions about that, so it's this endless... What conversations with Bill suggest to me is that we all need to be very careful consumers of whatever we read and whatever we listen to, and we need to have very well honed detectors.
I'm less concerned about a fabrication in this book of information. As Jane and I were talking this evening at supper, and she said, well, this writer has a definite point of view. And that's Chris's point, is she looked at all of this information and saw it in a particular way, whereas another writer might have seen it in an entirely different way, maybe starting from a maybe even unrecognized viewpoint that the one I was saying earlier. these cells could have come from anybody. Why was this family entitled to recognition, much less compensation? And if they had started from that point of view or from that mindset, it would have been an entirely different book. So she has a point of view, but doesn't mean that she fiddled the facts.
So one of the things when we looked at the library's guide to some of the discussion questions, there's one that starts with, as a journalist, comma, Skloot is careful to add, and we had some discussion about that. So, is she a journalist? Is she a science writer? What's the difference? Is who's entitled to have a point of view or not?
I don't recall her attributing thoughts, omniscience to any of her, maybe I read it very quickly, but I don't recall her attributing thoughts to people. She described their behavior, and for instance, the religious scene, remember, where she was frantically taking notes of every word that was said. But I don't recall in the many scenes with Deborah where she gave thoughts to Deborah, just behavior, objective behaviors.
However, she gave a choice of whose story she was going to hear.
Yes.
So in that way, she is giving a skewed perspective. She made a careful choice of, she was going to follow Deborah in her story, not one of the brothers.
That's what journalists do.
Right.
But partly who would talk to her.
Right, that was a big part of it, is that Deborah was the one most willing to share it with.
And if we want to get really philosophical, then that comes to what is truth? Is there an objective reality, or is everything filtered through
the eye of the beholder?
The eye of the beholder.
Put on a big pot of coffee. Call home, you're not going to be
Well,
home.
why stop with what is truth? We could also, go back to something that's pretty close to the book, which was what is fair, what is equal, what is just. And can we ever achieve that, and what are our roles in that?
And what we see as justice and injustice now, 50 years from now, people are going to be making fun of us for the issues that we're, probably.
That can happen. Some things are time set, and you talked about 1951. Yeah, my friend in 1970s, when she wanted her tubes tied, and they needed her husband's permission, she knew that was wrong. It was the times. It was normal times, and she still knew it was wrong.
It's a brilliant point. Saying it was the times doesn't mean there weren't people there who disagreed with it and knew it was wrong and didn't have much power or agency to be able to change it or respond to it. That's interesting.
So we published this event, the library published this event as 6:30 to 8, and it's about 7:45. And I'm aware that some people have participated a lot, and some haven't spoken up, but might have something that they are dying to contribute to the discussion or a question they want to ask. So, I just wanted to point out the time to us, and if you've been holding back, I want to encourage you to.
She was selling a product, this author. I mean, it is a book that we're going to buy. She's going to make money, folks. So you write it so that it's a popular subject for the time.
Do you see particular choices she made to further that goal?
Just the fact that now some of the racist sort of thing is not acceptable. It would be more saleable now than it would have been back then.
Well, I have heard, at least that she has been extremely shocked by the notoriety that the book has achieved. So I think that her real purpose was getting the story out, not to make money. And I partly think that because she was willing to do all this research when she didn't have any money. She was a student. And even Deborah found that suspicious. You know, what do you want from all of this? Saying, and I choose to think she's a reliable narrator and believe that actually is the truth. That she wanted to get the story out. She had no idea that it would turn into a bestseller like this, and is a little shocked by that.
And I believe some of the proceeds are also going to help the family.
Yeah, so I don't know the details of a foundation, but Rebecca Skloot has established some kind of a foundation to help with the education of the descendants of Henrietta Lacks. So that I think, again, I think that she recognized that in telling a story where there might be outrage about people profiting off of these cells, that she realized that she could be vulnerable to a charge of profiting off of this story.
It also goes to show that she's got a personal attachment to her subject, I would think. You know, if she's giving that money, she's got that bent.
Attachment?
Doesn't she and her father, don't they review science books too, though, and then write about them? And I'm just wondering if maybe she sees a pattern happening in science that she wanted to let the world at large know, and so she used this as a vehicle so that we can look at it, because I think that we are on some very precipitous times right now. What's going to start happening as healthcare becomes more expensive and less valuable? Not only healthcare for physical health, but mental health. And I know there are a lot of people that I work with who don't have the wherewithal to get good mental health, and there is a problem there, and there's going to be a bigger problem if we don't start addressing it. But I don't want us to go backwards into treating everybody as though we've got the right to do whatever we want because they need our help. And I think that's what she's trying to raise, those ethical questions so that we can look at them.
Because some of the questions that she raises have already been addressed, like informed consent. I mean, some of that has already kind of come up. So those kinds of changes aren't going to be made, but there are other, like Heidi brought up about the social issues that really don't have anything to do with the science experiments. There's a lot more there.
And informed consent isn't a closed chapter. There's certainly still examples where there have been failures of informed consent, where there are questions of whether consent forms have been presented in formats that people can understand. There was a case not too long ago, within the last decade, of a young man who participated in a clinical trial and died. I'd have to.
Jesse Gelson.
Yes, Jesse Gelson. And what was his condition? It was something that was treatable.
They injected him with a saline. I think that went wrong. But I'm going to interrupt you a minute because there's something more recent, and it has to do with informed consent. You're all aware that when babies are born, they have their heel pricked, and this blood sample is sent to the state, Minnesota Department of Public Health, and they treat baby. Well, first they screen for about 50 different diseases. Well, just in the last 5 years, 6 to 9 families brought a lawsuit against the state Minnesota Department of Health that they were taking these blood spot samples and using it for things other than what the family consented for studying these 50 named diseases. This case, the families lost at the trial court level, they lost at the appeals court level, and in November it went to the Minnesota Supreme Court, and the Minnesota Supreme Court found that, in fact, the Minnesota Department of Public Health did not get informed consent from parents to do and to send on these blood spot tests to other researchers who were using them to look for other diseases and to also do better testing for the tests that were consented to. And as a result, the Supreme Court told the Minnesota Department of Health they couldn't do that any longer. If they wanted to do tests, they had to have a consent form for all the tests, that the parents had to in fact consent to these tests or say they didn't want the tests done or only some of the tests done. And the parents could also say what they wanted to happen to the blood spots. So these blood spot samples, there was a large quantity of them in storage that all had to be destroyed. Now the question is, and I've been listening to the comments, the Minnesota Department of Public Health said, if you stop this, then that's going to shut down all of the research for newborns that we might have been able to get if not for this Minnesota Supreme Court saying that, no, that's wrong. So today, this moment, we have the state and we have the citizens and we have what's the better good. Does informed consent trump what Henrietta Lacks Sells did? Eventually we can say, but if it hadn't happened, we wouldn't have this, this, and this. I think we're going to grapple with that for a long time, and it's going to be up to each person, to make up their mind as to whether or not, if that was my baby, am I consenting to you sending off that blood spot anywhere for additional research that I never said you could do? Or am I trusting you that when I sign that form, you are going to do what I'm giving you permission to do? So that's how recent it's hitting in Minnesota. So this will make huge waves through other states now too.
Can parents decline to have that test done?
Yes.
Well, not,
Yeah.
oh, I suppose it, but,
Yeah, they can. They can decline, they can accept parts of it. So it should be informed. And since this has happened now, there's a little paper that says you can put it on the door to your hospital room. Do not prick my baby's heel unless you find me and ask me first.
The blood spots that they are using the test for, are the extra testing for infants or is it for other things?
It's for the newborn
It's all
screening
for
is
the
what it
newborns.
is.
So it's just extra things besides what you've consented to for the newborns.
Well, they're not doing anything additional to the baby, they're just.
No,
Just
this is for
that blood
tests.
sample.
Yeah.
Do you know when the Department of Health forwards this to these other researchers, is there identification possible going backwards? Or is it?
Not by that time. They actually had contracts with Mayo for multi-million dollars to do research in addition to, and it wasn't just Mayo, but Mayo was one of the primary.
Why would a parent object to that? I mean, I just don't know why a parent would object.
There are many that do. I don't know.
Because the government knows too damn much about us already.
but very early on in our discussion, I don't know which one of you ladies down there was talking about
The
brown
fear about
sweater,
being-
that, no, that more parents
Oh, yeah.
yeah.
do research for children than adults will consent for doing research. So, I mean, I guess, I don't know. I don't have children, so it's a tough one for me. But if you found out that testing saved your sister's kid, you'd probably be all for it, or your next door neighbor, or somebody where it really touched home. But I mean, it is a tough call, though.
I think a lot of times it's not necessarily the action, but it's the approach that
Right.
is taken. And I think that comes back to
Mhm.
also Henrietta. I think a lot of it isn't what they did, it's that they didn't ask.
Well, you think
And
about
that
the
maybe
same.
it isn't what, maybe it's not the heel prick, but
Mhm.
maybe it's that they were using it for something that they didn't say they were going
Yeah.
to. And again, it's the approach, it's not necessarily the
Yeah.
action. And it also is, the slippery slope. What is the precedence for that?
That-
Does that mean that my child's DNA is gonna be tied back and there's a precursor for
Mhm.
Alzheimer's, which means that my child's not gonna get, you know what I mean? I mean, it's a bit of a, like you said, Pandora's box. We don't really know where it might go.
Well, the people taking the samples they don't know. I mean, not too long ago I had blood drawn and I was like, so what happens with, because after they draw it, they keep it for a little bit because you can still test on certain things if they wanted more stuff done. And then I think, but the person that draws my blood, I said, well, what happens to it? They just kind of give me this blank stare, like, I don't know. I mean, because they genuinely don't know, and like you kind of wonder if that little vial goes off somewhere and they just do a little bit of testing on it, just randomly. No, because the person that draws it as a lab tech, they have no idea,
It's twice a day, it's put in a cart and wheeled up to some other
Yeah, if
floor.
you ask them what happens to it, they say it goes to the lab.
Right. It sits in a refrigerator for a little bit because if the physician wants more testing and they can do it on that sample, then they don't have to do more drawing and then they say, well, it's no good after so long, but how do you know they don't send it off before it's no good? I don't know.
Was the state of
Because you
Minnesota,
trust.
was the state of Minnesota actually selling these blood samples to other organizations?
They contracts with other organizations to get so many of the blood
Okay.
samples
So,
for
all right.
research.
And did anybody make any money from those transactions?
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, these were multi-million-dollar contracts.
Yeah, that's,
It's interesting.
that's where,
And obviously it has to be traced back to the child, because if you tested positive on one of those diseases, you'd want to know, to tell the
They only
parent.
have
So
that.
what if they tested for something else and came back and said, oh, also it has this, and
There's no identifiers when it goes out the second time. So they wouldn't know.
It's gonna be statistical research, I suspect, this
Right.
percentage.
But the problem is if they weren't truthful on the front end, when they tell that there's no connection, how can we believe that part? At what point is the trust broken?
But see, it kind of goes to this sort of pendulum swing where, like in the 50s, the culture was your doctor knows what's best and you do what your doctor
Right.
says. And now, you don't trust anybody for anything.
Right.
So it's sort of depressing, when you see that, because then you think about shutting down research that could be so valuable.
Yeah, another example would be like AIDS testing. When it was starting to become prevalent, it took years before we could test all mothers that were pregnant, knowing that there was treatment for the babies if they were diagnosed, but it was socially not acceptable to be able to do that for quite a few years. And now it is standard of care. People can opt out, but they have to opt out actively.
This is slightly different, and it deals with adults, and I'm harking back to Monday night again, which I don't know if it's really fair. But Dr. Sandy, this was for clinical testing, and apparently the form that people have to fill out to agree to that is several pages long and complex. And he said that in working with his own patients who are cancer patients, that
Library is now closed.
of course the issue of what you're doing now may help people in the future a great deal. And these are the treatments that would do, that ultimately about 90% of people's choices came back to what will it do for me? What will it do for me? And part of their concern was that I guess it's computerized what in the particular test happens to them, and people don't want to lose that control. So I think a lot of it comes back again to individual control.
Well, on behalf of my college saints collective, I want to thank you for coming out tonight and for sharing our thoughts. And we have the last closing point. Thank you.
We all know how important the polio vaccine is.
Yes.
And it was primarily the Sabin vaccine that we're using today, the oral vaccine. And there's an interesting story, and I can't remember if it's this month or last month, Scientific American, about Sabin's work and development of the vaccine and how he did massive testing in Russia. Now, if you're interested in just following up on that, it's current in a current magazine.
So we will continue to be lifelong learners.
Right.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for participating.